So, Jason Stanley, welcome to the Justice Collaboratory blog spot. You are our featured member here today, and we're very excited, Beth Parker and I, to talk with you about your forthcoming book, Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. And as we were talking before we hit record, one of the things that I think is so important about your work is that you get right to the heart of the matter and with language that anybody could access, right? That this is a really available, accessible book, and it is international in scope, which I think is really particularly valuable because we understand that this isn't a US phenomenon, and this isn't a somewhere else phenomenon, right? But that this is human history, right? And we have to be attentive to that and how these mechanisms operate. I have the same question written two ways, and so I invite you to answer it in the way that you think is most useful. The question that I rewrite is, I first say, what do fascists fear most about history? Or to say it another way, why is history an effective antidote to fascism?
Interesting. Yes, those are the same questions. And that's the same question. Well, history reveals that the past was not as great as fascism requires it to be. The structure of fascism requires a mythic past where everything was great, and then it was corrupted and made decadent by liberalism, Marxism, feminism, LGBT, and women getting abortions and everything. And so we have to return to this great past. History shows that the past was not all that great and not all that pure. It was neither pure nor great. So the other thing is so that's the basic abstract reason. It attacks one of the centrals of fascism, the mythic past. But there are other more mundane reasons. If you erase the history of, for example, social movements, then you can erase the sense that there have been any challenges to authority or any legitimate challenges to authority. So China erases the history of Tiananmen Square from its textbooks. Tiananmen Square being the student-led, the young people-led protest against China, pro-democracy protest against the Chinese government. So where thousands were killed by on the orders of the Chinese Communist Party. So they erased that history from their textbook. So no one knows that there was this democratic movement that criticized one-party rule. And Florida, similarly, Florida's under the control of an autocrat right now, Ron DeSantis, who is a Yale and Harvard graduate. And he has dictated that the history of Black Lives Matter can't be taught in Florida schools. So we have this idea that, history contains critiques of hierarchical structures. History contains critiques of patriarchy, the feminist movement, for example, LGBT, the movement for LGBT rights. These critique patriarchy. If you wipe out those effects, then you represent a background ideology as unchallengeable and universal.
Building on that, Jason, why do you think critical race theory is especially triggering for those on the right?
Great. Of course, it's local to the United States and seeped a little bit into Western Europe, but you can't use it in Hungary or Russia. You have to use gender ideology. But critical race theory, first of all, going back to Dana's first question, critical race theory helps explain fascism. It helps explain what's happening. Because if critical race theory is right, then there are structures that support hierarchy that there are structures, basic structures in society, banking structures, policing that retain the practices from an explicitly racial past. And that's how hierarchies are maintained. And so the rich people owe something because of the hierarchy that they inherited. So that obviously threatens the rich, it threatens hierarchy. So critical race theory says this. So on the very deep level, it provides us a critical analysis of authoritarianism, certainly its form in the United States. So secondly, and a much more mundane reason, as Christopher Rufus, the Republican propagandist and strategist, said, or the far right propagandist and strategist, I'm not the one who called it critical race theory. So it's just the expression sounds scary to Americans because we live in a society in which there was this conspiracy theory spread originally by the second Ku Klux Klan that Marxist Jews were fomenting a race war between Black people and white people so they could take over. And critical race theory kind of sounds like that. And if you look at the attacks on critical race theory from the books on them, I forget, there was a #1 bestseller. There's been a number of books from the far right doing this, and they all do the same thing. Critical race theory was brought into the United States. Critical theory was brought into the United States by the Frankfurt School, Marxist Jews, and then they taught Black activists. Marcuse was Angela Davis, in fact, Angela Davis's PhD advisor. But so they can spin this story of race war with a hidden background group that's also opening the borders.
So one of the things that, we're in this election year, right, which has been, newly reorganized and refreshed, if you will, right? So the mainstream media is telling some new stories than they were 2 weeks ago. But I really, in reading your book, thought I wanted to ask you if you could generate policy, right? Or if you were in a position to recommend policy to somebody who's in a position to create it or, even enforce it, what might you recommend at the local, the state, or the federal level to support or ensure reclamation of history or counter the erasure of history? Is there anything that policy or structure can do to support that?
People could say if the person won a Nobel Prize, you can teach it. Basic common sense. Being violated both in Hungary and the United States. In Hungary, they removed from the curriculum Hungary's only Nobel Prize winner, a Nobel Prize winner in literature since the Second World War, who's a Jewish Holocaust survivor. The same as they're doing to Toni Morrison, a Nobel Prize winner, Nobel Prize in Literature, American minority winner. So I think you'd have to have some. As usual, I think you have to provide the perspectives of significant minority groups, non-dominant groups in the United States. So in order for this to be a democracy, we must know each something about each other's perspective. Now, the United States has so many people from so many places. You can't do that with every single person. But we have a national minority, and it's quite clear that national minorities play a certain political role. Like, for instance, Jews played in Poland for hundreds of years. It's around that 10 to 14% number where your history is intermingled with that group. Muslims, I guess, would be the national minority of India. So we have a national minority here that plays a central role in our politics, Black Americans. We have an indigenous group here. We've got a large group in every country. A large percentage is LGBT. So we have workers, we have women. And so those perspectives have to be represented. And we have to guard against overbroad uses of charges of obscenity, because that is what the Nazis did. I mean, Toni Morrison is obscenity,
Right.
which is literally what the Nazis did with Jewish writers.
Let's talk about the books for a little bit, because this is something going on in a lot of states here. You talked about the book burning that happened near your father's apartment in Germany, and why that was such a significant event. why should we be concerned with all of the book banning going around today, even if it's not in our states?
The book burning of May 10th, 1933 is important both because I think it's still the largest book burning in history. I think it is the largest book burning in history, though I'll have to fact check that. And for me, I'm focusing on one of the contents of, I believe, 3 of the collections that were burned. One of the contents was the entire contents of the of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institut für Sexuelle Wissenschaft. What did they do at the Institute for Sexual Sciences? They had the largest collection of photographic evidence of gender fluidity. They had the largest collection of LGBT literature. So that tells us that what we see today, that LGBT are a central target. So argumentatively in the book, I was trying to address the fact apparent to all of us that internationally, including the United States, as we see LGBT people having to flee Florida, or people with trans children, what we see is that a feature is always attacks on gender fluidity. Now, why that's so, I don't know. I can speculate, but I don't quite know, but it's always true. So I'm bringing that out and pointing out that one of the 3 sets of books that was targeted were books establishing gender fluidity and giving LGBT perspectives, which were denounced as decadent and obscene. So I'm making the point that what you are now seeing has happened before.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. Very interested in your thoughts about social media platforms and what responsibility they have, whether it's for creating algorithms that silo us, right, that inhibit that multiple perspectives of history that you describe as so critical to what really history is, which is multiple perspectives, and that should they be mandated to create algorithms that actually expose us to multiple perspectives, and do they bear any responsibility for where we are in our stage of development of authoritarianism and fascism?
Dana, I'm not a moralist. I don't answer questions like that because they're beyond my purview. I'm not in the legal system. I'm an analyst. What my job is to do is to describe reality as it is. The solutions to why reality is so, unjust, the solutions to make it just, that involves questions of responsibility and legislation that are.
I mean, when I came to these questions and this thinking, because I think what your book does is say the technology is the technology. With the process, we'll use whatever technology is available. And I think that's interesting because people would like to just hold the technology responsible. If it that fascists in other eras didn't need the social media platform.
Well, I mean, it's indisputably true that fascism didn't need social media platforms. So it required advertising. I mean, the 1936, Leni Riefenstahl, who somehow got away, was nevertheless a very good. We got to watch as the intellectuals and the artists see that they can benefit from attaching themselves to these movements, because that's what sort of justified the Nazis. So I think good art, connecting, the propaganda value of art, is there, social media or not. Social media allows us more quickly to distribute conspiracy theories. There are more rapid response with emotion. So you have to mobilize. I suppose it's a particularly good device for both mobilizing and demobilizing, depending upon what you want to do.
It's true. one of the things that really struck me that I had never thought about was the fascist role in wanting to, and the fascist intent on gender roles, on keeping gender roles the same, which led me to think maybe that also translates to the pro-life movement. And but can you talk a little bit about why that is so important?
The structural ideological structure, the ideological structure of fascism is great replacement theory. And so great replacement theory is the idea that some dominant group, be they Jews, Hindus, white people, that some Christians, that some dominant group is being replaced. And the people doing the replacing are, and here there's a small debate in the literature, do they have to be Jews? They don't have to be Jews, because look at it. But we've been special historically as agents in the Great Replacement theory. Hitler thought we were agents in Great Replacement theory. He said, the Jews are responsible for the Senegalese soldiers. And this is the so-called Great Horror on the Rhine. That was big for Hitler, which is there were Senegalese soldiers occupying the Rhineland after World War I. And Hitler said, Jews are bringing them in to defile white women. So it wasn't kind of that example. It became world renowned, like there was this horrible thing happening in the Rhineland. So this idea that some group that are also the Jews Hitler hated were also the intellectuals and also the internationalists and also the liberals. So he could say also, where I had fit the ideology he wanted to attack. So that's the ideological structure of fascism. If you want to target a group, it looks like Trump has been targeting the Democrats, saying the Democrats are responsible for great replacement theory. But that's the ideological structure, and that's where the natalism comes from. So you want the country to be replenished by its people. So you want women to have large families. So Putin, you see the same thing going on as Masha Gessen has shown in Russia. Putin also is a natalist, and Putin and the Russian ideology of Putinism is natalist. And Putin, of course, justifies the Ukraine war as a war preventing the decadent ideology of parent one and parent two. That's his speech on the eve of the Ukraine war. That's how central traditional gender roles are to fascism. But natalism gets connected through, Russia, Putin wanted to replace the population that was lost to death. But the idea is you need to replace, you need to stop immigration and replace so-called native-born population.
And so do you think that feeds into the pro-life? Is there part of it? Because, we always hear this pro-life movement being a religious movement. Do you think there's part of it that's really about replacement theory?
Yes. For the Nazis, it was about replacement theory. There was a strict ban on abortion for Aryans. Of course, then the Nazis, like the pro-life movement, thought of, I'm not saying all pro-life people are Nazis, that's absurd, but the pro-life, but Nazism is very pro-life, because abortion is murder for the Nazis, and you can't abort any Aryan child, but you can't murder an Aryan baby fetus for them. You can't murder a potential Aryan, but you can destroy as many potential non-Aryans as you so desire. So yeah, abortion and natalism are directly connected. So your natalist movement, natalist, one of these people who's like gripped with natalism, like Putin or J.D. Vance, I guess. So natalism goes along. I'm just trying to think of examples of any natalists who are okay with abortion, and I can't. So, and obviously the problem with natalism is you just have immigration. That's like the solution. So there's no way of disentangling, for example, in the United States, natalism from white replacement theory.
Yeah. And I think, this highlighting this relationship really does help to understand what looks like hypocrisy to some of us. You are, this fetus must come to life, but you don't actually care if there's housing and food and education because you're only really thinking about certain babies.
Very good at the end. Exactly. Yeah. Because if people, people will sacrifice their own babies so as not to help the growth of the replacer babies. So the non-white babies, you just put I wish I had thought of that formulation before. But yes, that's exactly what's going. You have to explain the uniqueness of the United States in this regard, because other, Western European natalist far-right neo-fascist movements, Maloney, for example, don't have, they're pro, or Hungary or Poland, they were pro supportive families. So you don't want to say all far right, but in the United States, you've just explained why it's an exception. Because in the United States, racism functions in a particular way to not want the goods of society being given to non-whites. And so Batzel's book, Dying of Whiteness, shows.
So I have two more questions, and I hope we get to them because one is one I really want to end on. So I'm going to lead with the other one, with banking, that we'll get there. So I think you articulate a really important and I think under-articulated prior to your book distinction between types of nationalism, in particular a supremacist nationalism and an anti-colonial nationalism. So I wonder if you could, highlight those distinctions and maybe what would an anti-colonialist nationalism in the US look like?
That's a hard question, right? So can I get to your hard question by doing the easy questions?
Absolutely.
By saying, one thing to say in the small literature on Nazi education is that the Weimar education, the democratic government that preceded the Nazi takeover, so the Weimar education already was kind of militant nationalism. And so that allowed the Nazis to not change much. They already had like a supremacist version of nationalism, glorifying Germans. The Nazis added to that. This idea that the Third Reich was the natural inheritor of Rome, Greece and Rome. And then reading back into Greece and Rome, they would suggest in their textbooks that the Roman leaders who were great were German, and the Greeks were really Germans. So this idea of a nationalism that regards regards the nation as the greatest nation in history, and regards its people as the greatest people in history, and regards its founders as the inheritors of Greece and Rome, does not have a great track record. And this idea of reading whiteness back into history undergirds white nationalism. It undergirds the thought that the pervasive thought among white people that I'm including Europeans, of course, that white people did all the civilizational achievements, which of course exactly out of Mein Kampf. So, right, that's the answer. So I talk about supremacist nationalism because I want to draw that parallel. I want to say we're in a dangerous situation that's conducive to fascism. So here in the United States. Now, what would an anti-colonial nationalism look like in the case of the United States? I suppose it would look a lot like Black Lives Matter. It would, or, any social protest movement where the relationship between the United States government and them is analogous to colonialism. So probably not LGBT social movements, unless you think LGBT or maybe LGBT are colonized by, you could maybe stretch that, or maybe it fits. But the idea, but any movement that is a rebellion against that kind of erasure would be an anti-colonial nationalism, Black nationalism, as it functions in the United States. But you still have to worry about whether any form of nationalism is patriarchal.
What can an ordinary person do to kind of fight back against this erasure of history? What's it important that each of us are doing today?
It's terrifying to be a public school teacher and increasingly a public university professor in many states, particularly in the South. It's important to understand that, know when you're being propagandized. Think conceptual, like, for instance, the Divisive Concepts Act that bans any concept that makes people feel shame. It's clearly racist. It's clearly directed because if you ban the concept of structural racism, then Black children will think that their parents' poverty is their own fault and feel shame. So, think about how you want your kids educated. Do you want, the wealthy elite are never going to send their kids to schools that ban the concept of structural racism. What kind of education do you want your children to have? So, and then stand up in school boards, run for school board, the Republicans, I mean, there are plenty of Republicans who are not MAGA Republicans. The MAGA Republicans, Steve Bannon led Republicans, the far-right revolutionaries, they're going after these local positions. So if you want to fight them and fight for a good education for your child, fight to keep secular education alive, as we're trying to do when we look at countries like Afghanistan and Iran that lack secular education. We really don't want to be an Afghanistan or Iran. So run for local school boards, something like that.
Okay.
I don't want to misquote you, but you talk about people's conscious participation in their own unfreedom. And I think about this here, how can they untangle that for themselves so that they're not a part of that. I thought it was a beautiful phrase in the book. But here is my heart. There's not a lot that is heartening in the world, perhaps on a given day, that if we clear-eyed take in reality, as you say that you see your responsibility to tell reality as it is. But you ask a question toward the end of your book that I have been thinking about since I read it, and I am just moved by the beauty of what you propose and the language. And you charge us, maybe your readers, but I think beyond your readers, to think about and perhaps nourish and practice an education that would develop, and this is your phrase, a lifelong disposition towards civic compassion. And I think this is just an exquisite phrase, and you speak to your father's describing and discussion of civic compassion. And I just wondered if you could give us a little more juice to give more life to this phrase, civic compassion.
I'm going to embed this in my father's work on the concept of civic compassion. What he was trying to argue against was maybe a somewhat Deweyan conception of unity. He thought the idea that you should have a unified culture, even a unified democratic culture was for my father, because of this is what his obsession was. It was authoritarian. So he regarded any demand for a general will, in Rousseau's sense, any demand for one unified perspective as Americans, for example, he found that was too problematically authoritarian. And yet you needed something that allowed you to connect with your fellow citizens, with other human beings, in order for there to be a democracy. And so in order for there to be a well-functioning society. And that's what he called civic compassion. And that requires history, because it's understanding, as he defined civic compassion, it's understanding the route in which members of other groups have taken to become the citizens, to be part of this nation. So,
I mean, this to me is the answer to the question. I think you did answer it, even though you didn't want to, when I said, what would be the policy, right? And I think it's, I think it's really right on and invites a real localism. It doesn't rely on a canon, but like the education that nourishes a lifelong civic compassion should be the policy that supports, ensures, and allows for that, to me, right? So then it really moves us away from what the content of that curriculum.
absolutely. Yeah.
And at the same time demands a way of what that content is.
Right.
It's
It
just
requires indigenous history of social movements. In this country, in other countries, in Russia, it requires a history of Ukraine, the history of Jews. The history of any number of groups in Russia whose histories are being erased as we speak.
No. And I guess now, because of our education system, it's a state-by-state curriculum. So there really is no policy at the federal level that you could ensure that.
And I'm not a big, I try not to think about what legal policies are relevant. I would guess something civil rights law-ish that, not teaching the perspectives of certain groups violates that group's civil rights.
You could make that argument.
Yeah,
for sure. This is a question that's always perplexed. This has always perplexed me. What do you think attracts voters or citizens to fascist authoritarian leaders? What is it that they're looking for? And secondly, why do you think certain parts of the U.S. seem to be more susceptible to it?
Okay. These are questions that philosophers have been working on for the last 100 years. I guess, when was Wilhelm Reich? I guess that's the 30s. So 90 years or whatever. Adorno and co-authors' book, The Authoritarian Personality, is about this. What makes people susceptible to fascism? There's a social psychological literature since the authoritarian personality. Elsa Frankel-Brunswick, one of the co-authors of The Authoritarian Personality, went on to do a lot of research on the psychological character of someone who is open, who is inclined to authoritarianism over democracy. There's literature in social psychology a lot on this, but I'm not sure that we should think about it as established by quantitative means. I think we should think about it qualitatively, like what underlies that. Elsa Frankel-Brunswick looked to the family, the nuclear family, the family. And I think who knows how much, one dominant answer would be a patriarchal family leads you to lean towards authoritarianism as a political system. That is perhaps the central answer you're going to get out of the long history of thinking about this. Now, my own view on this, I would say that I need a theory of patriarchy of the sort that my colleague Robin Dembroff is developing. I don't myself have a theory of patriarchy. It's very clear that these movements, have these patriarchal people attracted to them come from patriarchal backgrounds, or those have authoritarian parents. However, we must pay attention to Western Europe right now. Giorgio Meloni, Le Pen, these are female leaders of neo-fascist movements. So you can't really, the ideologies are patriarchal. I think there it's more racial. So, race, religion, like Hinduism or Judaism, could, like, look at Israel now. Like, of course, authoritarians thrive under conditions of conflict between, with the enemy. So I think we have to think about race, patriarchy, racism. These are the things. Resentment. I mean, Rousseau would say when you have great inequalities, they breed resentment. That's my father's argument too. Civic compassion is what, and in places that lack civic compassion by culture, for instance, long-standing racial animus, or religiously based animus against LGBT, for instance, you would expect people to lack civic compassion and see democracy as this system that lets in the undeserved, the supposed undeserved.
And fear.
Fear, right. Now I'm giving more like Rousseau's answer, which is that resentment, large. I mean, at a certain point, fear takes. Well, I mean, there's fear of there's a fear you have in Russia, where it's like if you disagree with Putin, you're dead.
Right.
That's what we want to prevent, or even minor fear like being audited or something like that, or having your business forced to be sold by fictional taxes to so there's that kind of fear. But yeah, the fear of, you create this fear, you say, you represent to people that it is genuinely in their interests to retain their race, retain their cultural dominance, their racial dominance, and then you create fear that they will lose that dominance. Now,
I think it brings us back to your answer to my first set of questions, which is, right, that it's why this mythical past is so critical, right? And then people are afraid to lose it. But if you actually understood that the past was complex and there was not purity, then you would not need that simplistic purity to be, quote unquote, recreated, right? Because it, of course, is a myth. So I think that purity, that it's so helpful for me when you use that word, because I think it really characterizes what that mythology is all about.
Just summarized the book perfectly. Wish I had had that.
So what is the Trump campaign's tagline? I mean, make America great again?
Yeah. And this is obviously what's going on. I mean, I've been thinking this for years, that how could some of my fellow American Jews fall for this idea, let's praise the founders, let's not talk about bad things in America's past. Now, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany is running a campaign, a largely successful campaign. They're, I think, the second or first most popular party in Germany now, to get rid of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin and go back to and not thinking of the Nazi period as shameful or completely shameful.
What are your hopes for the book or for the next several months as these ideas hopefully travel far?
I hope to help representatives who have already figured this stuff out for the most part. I mean, I want to provide some kind of manual for stuff people know anyway, who are politically engaged in the front lines, like Tennessee or something. I'm thinking about someone like Representative Justin Jones, who gave a speech about the Orban's Danube Institute on the floor of the Tennessee House. So who want to see, who would be helped by seeing a book that might reflect their experience and validate their experience. I mean, those are people I learn from, of course. I learned more from 45 minutes of talking to Justin Jones, a lot was validated for me from what he said. Like, what the hell is the Tennessee state legislature doing, passing a resolution honoring Viktor Orban's think tank, which is clearly written by Viktor Orban's think tank, because Representative Justin Jones asked him, do you know who Viktor Orban is? And the guy proposing the legislation said no. So, Hungary is looks like it's directing
State legislation.
Legislation for Tennessee. So you're like, whoa, thank you, Justin Jones, for validating, and then, that was one of like 10 things that he validated in my analysis. The role of Hillsdale College. I was dragged on social media lately for saying that Hillsdale College was part of an authoritarian movement to erase history. No, it's Yale and Harvard that are the problems. Hillsdale College isn't. Go to a southern state. So I hope for it to connect dots, validate the perspectives of the people from whom I've learned, and explain the perspectives of what I've learned from activists, union organizers, public school teachers.
Yes.
Great. And journalists. Don't forget journalists, because I'm connected to a lot of journalists in a lot of these countries and learn a ton from them. So Patricia Campos Mello in Brazil, Natalia Gumeniuk in Ukraine, that's just two, Rana Ayub in India. Those are just some of the journalists who've been fighting this.
There was some interview with Steve Bannon, and he was talking about, in his garbage way, of all the things that, white people had made in America. And I was like, how come no journalist said name two?
Right.
Name two. Not even five, dude. Two. You say, oh, right? Because he couldn't, right? Because we know that, this country was not built exclusively or even primarily by white people in any stretch of the imagination, right? And so I see that like this book can really offer people who are dialoguing with fascist and authoritarian leaning folks a way to have a conversation that will highlight what their position really is.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard when you're analyzing reality and trying to get reality right to think about what you hope to do. I hope to get reality right. I hope this story that I'm telling of interconnected interests, interconnected ideologies and figures across countries, repeated structures, I hope that's accurate.
It makes, for somebody who is politically aware, politically involved, concerned about what is going on in the United States and the world, it really wraps a bow on it and puts it in perspective. It puts a name on it. It's like a diagnosis,
right?
Like a medical diagnosis almost.
Exactly. For me, it was you're a cartographer.
Right.
To me, you're a cartographer. Yeah. But I really, really appreciate you putting the U.S. in world history and sort of removing that exceptionalism, both in ways that are, great and not so great, right? But that really plants us on the globe, which is where we are.
Right. Exactly. So I think we can begin and end with the fact that I'm a philosopher, because it's the generalizations that will emerge from that are naturally drawn to. Historians have a very different character. They're like, I can only tell you about Indonesia, but I'm attracted to generalizations, which is both a critique. People are like, well, he's not a scholar of India, but he speaks a lot about India. So legitimate critique. I want to theorize in the right level of abstraction. And I believe there is a structure, and the structure can be, has agents and actors and interests. So I think other people believe there is no general structure. So those are my commitments.